So, good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all to the fourth day of the Gyan course titled Women Writers and Thinkers in the Modern Critical Tradition. Today's speaker is Professor Meena Mitrano. Welcome, ma'am, once again. Today, we also have our course coordinator, Professor Rajni Singh, with us. So, I am taking this opportunity to introduce today's speaker, Professor Meena Mitrano, to you all once again. So, Professor Meena Mitrano is an associate professor of Anglo-American literatures at Ca' Foscari University, Venice. Her research focuses on modernism, literary theory, and feminist thought, with a particular interest in the works of Gertrude Stein and Susan Sontag. She has taught at various institutes, including Rutgers University, Sapienza University of Rome, Loyola University, Chicago. Her new book, Antigone e il legame di fratellanza, explores the figures of Antigone and its political implications. On behalf of the course coordinating team, I welcome you, ma'am, once again to your lecture. And we are looking forward to an insightful lecture as usual. So, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Atalanta, for that kind introduction. Welcome, everyone, to Lecture 5. Now, today's overall title is Feminism and Form. And the work we did in the previous lectures is meant to help us walk toward the core of the lecture series, feminism and form. The core is, of course, the contribution of women writers with particular attention to feminist theory. So I'm very pleased today to welcome you to this lecture where I will have the honor and the pleasure to introduce you to an Italian feminist thinker, Carla Lonzi. Allow me to share the PowerPoint so that we can start. Okay, and you should be able to see it on the screen.
Yes, ma'am, we can see it. We can see it, and you are also audible.
Thank you so much, Atolanto. So, Carla, the title of Lecture 5 is Carla Lonzi and the Unthought. Yesterday, our sparkling discussion during the tutorials, you may remember, revolved, among other things, the activity of reflection, thought, thoughtlessness, the idea of stretching language to create or envision a space in it. Well, Carla Lonzi is very, as we shall see, is very much concerned with that. Now, let me introduce her with a picture. Carla Lonzi was based in Italy, but she spent a brief stretch of time in the US. Here you see her in 1967 with her companion Pietro Consagra, the sculptor and artist Pietro Consagra. Now, before we actually dive into Lonzi's thought, let's recap our achievements in Lecture 5. We have looked at new directions in literary criticism. We have looked at, in particular, at the contribution of two key American women writers and thinkers in the persons of Susan Sontag and Eve Sedgwick. And we have been especially concerned with how both these thinkers track the transformation of the critic, how they question, in fact, the figure of the critic and the notion of the text. Today, we'll continue along this route. In Lecture 5, I plan exactly to continue to track the transformation of literary criticism, but from an international perspective, no longer just limited to the Anglophone world, but from the vantage point of an international perspective, here represented by the Italian feminist thinker Carla Lonzi. So I like to intersect Anglophone contemporary critical discourse of the critical tradition with the work of Carla Lonzi. Um, and the aim is to further illustrate how this stretch of tradition, with the intervention of women writers and thinkers, actually is about an ongoing question of the figure of the critic and what his or her task should be. So the first, let me begin with the connection between Lonzi and critique, the contribution that Lonzi has to make to critique. You see on the screen the first edition, 1969, of Lonzi's masterpiece. I'm defining it a masterpiece because it was a changer in the landscape of both art criticism and literary criticism. Autoritratto, this is self-portrait. Self-portrait. But what this book is about is actually the transcript of conversations that Lonzi had with several artists, and where the critic herself withdraws actually, takes herself away from the picture, minimizes her presence to let the artists speak in the first person about their own critical views about art. It's a very interesting um, book. The premise is that Lonzi was, of course, lived, as I said, lived in the US briefly, particularly in Minneapolis, for 6 months in 1967, where she joined her companion Pietro Gonzaga. Uh, what, was, what was she doing there? I will get back to the former slide shortly. In Minnesota, she started to transcribe, and you see this rather domestic picture of Lonzi leaning leaning on a notebook, but actually what she's doing, she's transcribing voices from the tape recorder. She's transcribing all the conversations she had over time, over a span of years, with a variety of artists. Conversations that would become a transcript, that would become autoritratto, the text that you saw in the former slide. Now, who is Carla Lonzi? I told you, she's Italian based, but she was originally an art critic. She received a formation as an art critic in Florence, actually, but she went on to develop as a critic a certain familiarity with artists. She loved to be immersed in the art making world, observe directly. And she has come to understand that the point of her criticism is not evaluation, but, and I quote her in Autoritratto, a work of participation, of comprehension. And here, I'm struck in this quote by the word comprehension, which is a very basic word. We use it all the time. But comprehension here has a double meaning. It has the meaning of, yes, grasping, grasping something, but also a kind of empathy as putting yourself in the other's place, comprehend, understand in the metaphorical sense as well. The crisis, she by pursuing the notions of participation, that is a participatory kind of criticism, she bumps into the crisis of criticism, a crisis that reflects on the possibilities of form of the discourse. What kind of critical discourse is desirable for this closer familiarity with artists? What kind of discourse can do justice to the creative act? So she posed that question, and that question had a consequence. She left art criticism and she founded Italian feminism. She founded feminist theory in Italy. So she's a pioneering figure, very much so. Only recently her work has been translated, and that's why I take a special pleasure. And again, I introduce Lonzi with humility, as I did in the other thinkers yesterday. because they walk the boundaries, of course, between philosophy and literature, because they need to. They need to talk from within a hybrid space of discourse. She is a pioneering figure, the founder of a feminist theory in Italy, and I'm saying I take pleasure in introducing her because since she's not known in the, or not so much in the Anglophone world, since her work has only recently begun to be translated, I'm hoping that some of you might get interested and welcome her in the transnational space and perspective that I know you are from Rajni, from Professor Singh, you're interested in. So, Autoritratto, I said, and you saw Lonzi transcribing the conversations, is a series of conversations. Who are the artists part of these conversations? Who are the animators of these conversations? First and foremost, the artist and sculptor Pietro Consagra. I'm aware that these are new names for you, or might be apart from Cy Twombly, perhaps, but these are the artists. Pietro Consagra, Lucio Fontana, Mimmo Rotella, Giulio Turcato, Yannis Kounellis, Greek Italian. At the time, all these artists I named and whose names I read were part of the Italian avant-garde of the early 60s. Cy Twombly, the last one, was an American artist who had wielded authority already in the US, but who had relocated in Italy, first in Rome, and then in my birthplace in Italy, Gaeta, Gaeta, where he established a studio. So let us perhaps take a first-hand look at Autoritratto. It was first published, before I read from this representative quote in the introduction, let me give you some very generic info to help contextualize the text. It was first published in 1969 and reissued in 2010. It's a landmark experimental text, and it mirrors the crisis in Lonzi's career, the crisis that prompted her to transition from criticism to feminist theory. Now, Lonzi had been a practicing artist, but she, at a certain point, she experienced the same perplexities that Susan Sontag had about interpretation. We unpacked those perplexities yesterday. You showed great interest in those perplexities. Lonzi experienced the same doubts about an aggressive form of interpretation that excavates and is intent on grabbing the meaning, extracting perforce the meaning of a text while not doing justice actually to the rest, form, the creative act, or even the way in which the critic is influenced and his or her personality or task can be changed reciprocally and mutually shaped by this more, let's call it empathetic vicinity, proximity with art making, the gesture of making art. So the dilemma we confront in self-portrait is that of a critic who has developed a certain closeness with artists and has come to understand that the point of her criticism is no longer evaluation, but as I read, in the former slide, a work of participation. This crisis is reflected in the introduction to self-portrait. Allow me to read. This book is a collection and a montage of conversations. Remember, when we talked about some notes on camp. against interpretation itself is actually a bunch of notes. It's a collage, montage of fragments. So you can see in that gesture of breaking down the classic format of the argumentative expository essay, you can already see the assertion of a closeness to art making, art as the prime site of criticism for both Sontag and Lonzi, that I had with some artists. But the conversations were not intended to be the materials for a book. They respond less to the need to understand and more to the need to be with someone in a manner that is preeminently communicative and humanly rewarding. It's almost an existential register. But it's a kind of, it's not understanding, the aim is not understanding in the sense of excavating a meaning, but in the sense of comprehending, that is understanding in the sense of an empathetic, as she says, humanly rewarding, communicative interaction. The work of art has been felt by me at a certain point, she's pinpointing the moment of crisis, as the possibility of an encounter. This is key. As the possibility of an encounter. As you know, encounters are encounters only if they come with a certain wonder, with a certain perplexity, with a certain disorientation and excitement at the same time. As an invitation to partake issued directly by the artist, an invitation to partake, to share, partake, be involved, an invitation issued by the artist. So you have the critic, the artist, no longer that dichotomy, that hierarchy, the critic trying to control and excavate the meaning and setting himself or herself up as the authority who can explain to the larger audience the meaning of a work of art. Here you have this lateral interaction, this lateral relation. She's reinforcing the relation between criticism and the primary discourse of art. She's talking about art, but we can certainly imagine literature and posing the same problem for her. In fact, we shall see that that is the case when we come to her feminist theory. So it has seemed to me a gesture for which I had not been professionally trained. She's swerving away, turning away from academic, traditional, classic criticism. And by that, she means exactly what Sontag meant in Against Interpretation. She's not rejecting the notion of understanding. The task of the critic is one of understanding the work of art, but she's looking for a different posture. We are back to Foucault a little bit, turning away from the academic tenets of criticism toward a different discourse. So 2 points need to be stressed here. Point number one, when Lonzi understands criticism as the possibility of an encounter, she troubles the critic-artist hierarchy, which is a hierarchy you remember. I mean, you remember we talked about this. That has to do with the gaze, exerting a controlling, surveilling gaze. Point number two, the second point is related to the first, is that it follows, that is, criticism follows it follows that the consequence is that criticism and therefore the task of interpretation exceeds disciplinary boundaries, exceeds, because the familiarity, the closeness that Lonzi is embracing as a value or as a virtue actually functions, as the theoretical function of gesturing toward a different critical discourse that belongs neither to one specific discipline nor to the other. So her experiments with the recorded conversation with the tape recorder at the time, 69, and she started earlier, so the tape recorder was like our computer in a way. The experiments with technology, with recorded conversations, are an attempt to envision a different critical discourse. She's, tampering, tinkering, experimenting with envisioning a different critical discourse. I would like us to look at some specific passages from autoritratto, self-portrait. The self is, of course, the most enigmatic word. Self, what does it stand for? This is a portrait, but it's a portrait of artists, or does she mean that artists are offering a self-portrait, or does she mean that the critic is the self of the critic is becoming enmeshed and therefore lost in these self-portraits of artists? Uh, some excerpts. Let's begin about an excerpt about the critic. How the critic appears in self-portraits. When I found myself working as an art critic, I saw that it was a phony profession. This is a moment when Lonzi herself interjects, one of those few moments when Lonzi herself interjects her voice in between the conversations. I saw that it was a phony profession, completely phony, that it had maybe 90%, let's say, was the university. So you can see the grain of the voice. This is a voice transcribed. She is not concerned about syntactical correctness. She is keen on transcribing voices exactly as they articulate their speech, including hers. And so I kept away from the professional aspect of the activity of the art critic and little by little individuated the elements that for me are completely intolerable. The most intolerable is this: that art criticism should be an activity that calls forth individuals like myself who wanted to have a deeper initiation than what is typically considered a cultural one, right? So remember, Sontag wanted to write an essay that would neither be cultural criticism nor historical. And Lonzi, in a way, is in this very simple way, is pointing to the same desire to write a different kind of critical discourse that is not just surface grazing cultural, packing up or unpacking for an audience in a clear way what art objects are. She is after something else. Another excerpt, the critic, rather than being he who is accommodating any need, becomes he who judges and creates a hierarchy. That's what happens in classical academic standard criticism, the criticism that she wants to turn away from. Um, And in this activity, he ends up carrying out, he raises the point of departure from which he began and becomes a completely inauthentic person, no longer authentic. Ultimately, a part of humanity produces things, okay, a creative part, a whole other part of humanity comments on these things. Now, this commentary as a function that society performs on art seems to me quite useless and in the end becomes damaging because that part of humanity that produces things should, I think, inspire another part of humanity to absorb and to produce. We need not users but producers. Just this vision of an active humanity not divided into classes, not divided into those who produce and those who receive, readers and writers, critics and artists, but the idea that art production instigates also other forms of production, including new forms of criticism, to develop creative condition in people, a creative condition in people, to live life in a creative way, not in obedience to the models that society proposes over and over. You see how the intimate link here comes to the fore, the intimate link between art making, criticism, and models and political models and the polis society. So for Lonzi, as for Sontag, I would say, but in a greater degree for Sedgwick and for feminist critics, since Susan Bubar, okay, there is no way of untangling, separating, keeping apart the aesthetic and the political. They are always already intertwined, linked, because thinking about the art object, whether it be a canvas or a text, is automatically thinking about how we obey or don't obey models that society proposes over and over. And this is the essence of critique, this aesthetic, keeping well inside the aesthetic political continuum, is the essence of critique. Critique has been under attack because some scholars like Stefan Collini, for example, say that the political, the scale has tipped on the side of the political has taken over. But, there are ways of countering that. We in our interaction have already talked about this problem, about the need for balance, objectivity, etc., etc. But the aesthetic political continuum is something Lonzi cares about, as it will be for it will be a focus for Lord as well, as we shall see in the next lecture. But to stay, Lonzi's views are echoed by artists. I mean, in Autoritratto, most of the text, the greatest part is the artist speaking. If you're curious, there is a translation, a new translation. But there are the point is that we were particularly keen on knowing about Lonzi's view because we are interested in seeing in looking at their contribution to criticism, but Lonzi's view are echoed by the artists in these conversations. There is no conflict, or there is rather a confrontation rather than a conflict between artists and the critic. For example, Greek-Italian painter Yannis Kounellis, in conversation with Lonzi on the need for the critic to be the emissary of the artist, not the evaluator, but the emissary of the artist, says, because to be the emissary of the artist means putting yourself in the same condition as the artist, namely as a man who lacks any power at all. Now, you may argue that Kounellis is putting out there an idealized image of the artist, and this text is historically marked. The idea of the artist has changed over time, but the point that Kounellis is trying to make is that the distance between the critic and the artist should be abridged, that should be bridged and should not be so remarkable that, in fact, the critic should put herself in the same condition of the artist. There is a condition that is other than power. Let's put it that way, other than power. So the motif of power actually runs through self-portrait. Lonzi is interested in meditating about the power of the institution, of how criticism can be not instituted but institutionalized. In fact, Lonzi will institute a different kind of criticism when she institutes feminist theory, but she's concerned with a criticism that is institutionalized, that becomes, a commended model. And she's concerned, she hopes that the role of the critic will be a facilitator of the public's, in general, the public's critical spirit. Today, the disappointment in criticism doesn't come from criticism lack of culture. So the problem is not criticism. No, really, it's about discovering an institution that distorts what you wanted to express with your work. Okay, and this is important because the public later bases its own opinion on the criticism. The public wants to understand, as the critic does, since they are not interested in making as the artist does. So standing before the starkest work possible, she's thinking of abstract art, probably the starkest, standing before the starkest work possible, and which directs the public to the farthest reaches outside of culture. That wish to bring people, yes, bring them to the point of being able to clear their minds of everything everyone else has said about the world, about things, about life. So the act of understanding, it's not just the act of looking at a painting, even the strangest painting, and trying to decipher. Yes, it is that, but within a larger enterprise, within a larger vocation, that is to say, looking at something strange while shedding all the presuppositions, all the ready-made ideas, all the critical infrastructure that you have been trained with. Fresh, encountering it with a fresh perspective. Uh, Closeness to finally, before we move to the next section, I wish to emphasize what Lonzi meant by closeness to artists. This is a tenet. This is a tenet in a critical practice, and you can understand it as dismantling the hierarchical relation in favor of a different kind of relation. And, the best word that comes to mind is closeness, but you could name it in a different way. One can be close to artists today also by listening and listening again and again to them if you don't understand them at first. So a greater form of attention, but a translation of one's vocabulary into the vocabulary of the other. But how can you make a gesture like this afterwards, which is a gesture of the critic's absolute impotence? Because if you take a recorder, it means that as a critic, you no longer exist in the traditional sense. That's why she resorted to the recorder. She wanted to erase her older critical self, clear an opening toward a new critical self that is a new critical discourse. How can you then make the old gesture again? This yes, this other no. There is evaluating. This artist is valuable. This no, I reject this, I accept that, and I influence the audience, thereby. You can't do it. The first time that I used a recorder, I said, "What's happening?" I didn't really understand. I really felt strange with this device. It isn't something that's so obvious. And then I said, "Well, it's logical that I felt this way. That is, I want to be close to artists and to free myself as a person who may have this academic culture." Because the funny thing is that the critic learns what the artist is at while at university. He learns about historical texts and then his own conception of the artist, of the critic, and of culture, and then he never questions them ever again with the recorder or otherwise. So she is denouncing, the Italian education system in a way. She's pointing out that it's a very elitist and system, very entropic, closed in on itself, and very imploded, I wanted to say, very imploded, closed in on itself. Now, closeness means collaboration, however, the logical step is collaboration. And one of the highlights in Lonzi's career was her collaboration with artist Carla Accardi. Here you see an image of Accardi in her studio. She had a studio in Rome, and she's preparing an exhibit to be held in Torino in 1964. So at the same time as Sontag's Notes on Camp, Against Interpretation, Lonzi and Sontag resonate with each other in ways that has not been unpacked yet. The fruit of the collaboration is this work of art. You see a tent, 65, 66, It's not a canvas. Cardi moves away from the traditional canvas as a support, and she begins to experiment with what at the time was called Sicofoil, a kind of plastic that today is no longer in use. I mean, I think it was put out on the market in the 80s, sometime in the later 80s. But at the time, it was a radical turn toward an experimental kind of painting. This is not a painting, but is it a sculpture? Is it an installation? The fact remains that she paints on psychofoil, on plastic, signs, these enigmatic marks. Let me give you a slightly larger view of tent. I recently, I think it was last year, I saw this in Rome at Palazzo delle Esposizioni. It's really a spectacular scene up close. Here is so the idea of a shelter where everyone, okay, it's a playful shelter. And this is a close-up of her painting on plastic plastic support that is no longer the canvas support. It's enamel, and these are enigmatic signs. So you can see also a gesture toward the notion of language as a system of signs, a kind of calligraphic, enigmatic form of art writing, kind of writing, undecipherable, still to be deciphered writing. Very, very playful and very bright colors. Let me read. I'm not going to read everything because I wanted to share with you, I mean, get to the point of sharing with you the transition to feminist criticism. But here in this passage that we can certainly return to during the tutorials, or you can savor alone in your solitude, or when you study, or in groups. Was born out of a postcard that Lonzi sent Cardi, a postcard. So it begins as a collaboration in the very concrete sense of sharing materials and then taking off from those materials. And the idea of the tent was prompted by a thought that came to me when you showed me those images in a postcard of the Turkish tents in the museum in Krakow. So there is the material, the postcard, the idea of the Turkish tent, so a non-Western form of shelter, moving out of your geographical comfort zone or what everyone else was doing. I want to get to the red ink part because that is where Accardi articulates the change, the transformation that the collaboration with Lonzi had led to. So now the novelty is having experimented with what one can produce by removing emotions that seem inherent in art. Why did she abandon? Why did she turn away from the canvas as a support? The canvas, whether on the floor, working on the floor, or whether on the easel. She wanted to move away totally from that because automatically even the rawest canvas was associated with certain emotions. The painting came encrusted with past emotions, and she's talking about collective emotions in the tradition, for example, Western painting, which perhaps are in certain periods. But I didn't know it would happen because by removing everything, nothing might have been left. She was scared because by turning completely away from painting, she might not have had anything to say as an artist. Her identity as an artist might have collapsed. However, perhaps if someone has a certain way of being, a certain care, trying to understand, yes, to see in a new way by emptying, taking away. Remember the mollusk withdrawing, okay, taking away, diving into the wreck, the scenario of destruction, whether to write a new book of myths or whether to do something else, taking away, emptying. In the end, it's not true that there is nothing left by removing everything. Then those who say, a card is getting lost with plastics, a card is no longer finding her way toward art, just wait. You lose yourself, she's told. I say, I have the right to make the simplest, most mundane gesture, to experiment. If by doing it every day, trying to live in a non vulgar way and stripping everything around, this in the end remains. So the turn is not related to just creating the new for the sake of the new. It's linked to a form of life with certain values, care, taking away. To reach a point of removing seems like a sign of maturity, a very refined part of maturity that can be found in many artists. I remember that I always said it as a completely personal need, one to which I hold dearly. This word kept coming up for me. It was more important to remove than to add. So finding a new direction, collaborating even with the most mundane or domestic of object, taking inspiration from that, and especially having conversations. Because a card, the tent comes from conversations with Lonzi. Now, one of the most influential, I think, essays by Lonzi is an essay that was published in a newspaper. So to give you the idea of how um, how much she cared about disseminating ideas to the larger public about getting out of the segregated space of academia. It was published in a socialist newspaper at the time called Avanti, the 13th of December, 1963. And the argument that she makes in The Solitude of the Critic is particularly interesting for us. She talks about, she begins with the historical avant-garde, the turn of the modernist avant-gardes, the revolution of the modernist avant-garde. What was it? Well, it was not just about creating new art, it was a new operation of truth. So it was no longer a knowledge that can be certified by an authority. When Duchamp created, nude descending the stairs or the urinal, it was, yes, it was also an iconoclastic gesture, but the message was, okay, this art cannot be verified, certified by any authority. It is left to the individual fruition, to the individual, judgment, sensibility. The avant-garde asks us to accept as truth from what flows from a spontaneous constitutional consciousness, that is from an individual sensibility, individual awareness, individual interaction, and tete-a-tete with the singular individual work of art text. It exceeds the point that Lonzi is trying to make, is that the operation of truth promoted by the avant-garde, which was an epistemological operation, not just an art operation, that's her point, exceeds patriarchal certification. It exceeds the authority and disciplinary boundaries. It exceeds patriarchal, central patriarchal authority, and it also exceeds disciplinary boundary. You may hear an echo of Roland Barthes' rejection of the work of art and the inauguration of the text, which, according to him, rejects the father. But Lonzi is not interested in using an anti-theological idiom, and it's an important detail. So, what is the new task of criticism? I quote from what I think is the essential quote in The Solitude of the Critic. The new task of criticism is that of identifying the kind of artistic production that appears as, quote, the creation of techniques of life through which we react in a non-neurotic way social myths, to the clash of cultures and traditions, to dissolving boundaries, and to what in general it seems apt to call a new planetary condition, una nuova condizione cosmica. She uses the term cosmic. I thought of it would be good to translate planetary because what she is anticipating here, sensing, is this fall of all sorts of boundaries, including first world, third world, including imperial states and colonized regions of the world, including men, women, of course, the gender hierarchy, including critic and artist. So the binary and the hierarchy critic artist is embedded in a larger transformation. The larger and widespread need to inaugurate, institute new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking. And therefore, we get to this is how feminist theory in Italy was born. The fundamental texts of Italian feminism, as represented by its founder, Carla Lonzi, are two. Let's spit on Hegel, iconoclastic, avant-garde gesture, meant to capture attention, and then the other is a two volume work called Be Quiet, entitled Be Quiet, Rather Speak, Diary of a Feminist. Why do I point to these two foundational texts? Because when read together, when examined together, they illustrate the transition to different practice of criticism, a kind of critique, yes, that has a living, a palpitating element in it, a living thought. Not just the idea of critique as ideological critique, but a living thought that tries to do justice to, as we saw in Lonzi, to the vicinity, the closeness of art and discourse on art, so literature and discourse on literature, without criticism becoming creative writing. What does it mean? However, what does this transition mean? It means that it means the widespread desire for a critical thought rooted in experience, a practice. Now, as you know, feminism, the earlier practice of historical feminism in the second part of the 20th century is autocoscienza, self-consciousness, okay, whereby discourse, among others, public discourse, or the truth of public discourse is rooted in individual experience. It's a kind of self, okay, witnessing, self-aliturgy, we could call it, if we were inspired by Foucault. It's meant to generate knowledge of the unthought, that is, everything that has remained in the folds of dominant traditional accepted discourse, especially the experience of women and how the experience of women can help redefine truth, redefine discourse, redefine thought. But also with this desire, the exigency for form. I mean, what kind of form? What kind of form can this living thought take? It's an urgent question. So there is the use of different forms is really a desire. And this is very loud in Let's Spit on Hegel and in Diary of a Feminist. Now, Let's Spit on Hegel. Why the strong iconoclastic title? Because it is important for Lonzi to turn away from Hegel's model. In a time where everyone was more or less Marxist, Hegelian or Hegelian Marxist, that's why she needs to say loudly, à la Duchamp, she needs to make a gesture à la Duchamp and say, well, respect on Hegel. But why? Well, the reason is that the servant-master dialectic, she says, is a settling of accounts between groups of men. It does not foresee, of course, it does not contemplate the role of women. It's the great oppressed of patriarchal civilization. Without reading all the slide, I just want to recap why it is important to turn away from Hegel, because it is not the master-slave dialectic that she's looking for as the basis for this new living knowledge. She would like to dismantle, to use Lord's word, dismantle the master-slave dialectic in favor of a different kind of relation, a more ethical, an ethos-oriented model, whereby accepted ideas of masculinity are emptied of their power, and therefore feminist theory and women can help men not to be oppressed by their patriarchal role. It has a very ethical drift. You will find the same ethical drift in Adrienne Rich, for example, in her great essay on women and honor. Feminism is not just an oppositional, adversarial, confrontational movement. Feminist theory is about theorizing a different kind of basic tenet that helps us think about associated life, society, interconnectedness among the individual. And as great as Hegel was, because Phenomenology of the Spirit is a great novel. I mean, you can read it as a novel and be engrossed. But the basic tenet, the canvas support is, so to speak, the master-slave dialectic, and therefore the emancipation of the slave from the master. So, Lonzi is into something different. She is into the last quote on this slide, depriving the male culture from the illusion of universality. And feminist theory can do a lot in eroding, minimizing, dispersing the authority of the assumed universality, whether it's the I think or whether it's the artist. One of the key moments in the feminist in her feminist diary helps illustrate exactly this point I've been trying to make, and I like to read the quote. Just checking time. It's August the 8th, and she writes in her diary again, the diary form, so the search for different critical forms of critical discourse. In Sputiamo su Hegel, let's speak on Hegel, I said, let's abandon man to himself, meaning to the inauthentic assimilation of himself to the phallus, power. Now it is a different moment. It seems to me that it is inferior not to give man the opportunity to reveal himself authentically, that is, without power, authentically, because it is superior not to give importance to authenticity, to take away from man the misrecognition of authenticity is to take away his sense of power, to return him to equality. This is what deconstruction is from the perspective of Lonzi, hence from the perspective of Italian feminist theory. The inferior person frees himself or herself from inferiority in the hierarchy, master slave, man, woman, inferiority is an issue. The inferior person frees himself or herself from inferiority by recognizing his or her own inferiorization and becomes a subject As a subject, she casts his or her gaze on the other and measures the other against authenticity, which is the value discovered in his or her liberation. What is authenticity? Well, the question remains to be answered. Let me just end with, the follow-up to the previous quote, the read in part. The male dialectic of master-slave leads to a new form of domination by the oppressed. If we connect, if we build our thinking, our critical thinking on the male dialectic of master-slave, that leads to a new form of domination, she says, by the oppressed, because the slave identifies his or her inferiorization with the lack of power and therefore constructs himself or herself in the image of the master. You can hear psychoanalysis here. Lonzi never mentions Lacan, but she is parallel to Lacan. She's working with psychoanalysis. The concern is the image, how we construe our identity, often in the image of the other. And the master-slave Hegelian model for her fails because it supports, it fuels, it furthers this inauthentic, she says, constructional identity. While she must dismantle, notice that she uses the same verb as Baudrillard, the inferiorization within himself, herself. Transition to feminism meant a theory of the subject, a different theory. The subject in the act of casting a different gaze on the other. And casting a different gaze means using language as well. Anyone who is interested in renewing, reforming theories of the subject has a stake in language, does not want to discard it. And for Lonzi, language is absolutely central. So we've looked at Lonzi's version of critique, and by that we mean an ampler view of criticism, the ampler view of criticism that she inaugurated in her work. On the side of the social, the criticism on the side of the social and the political role of art in imagining a better world or a freer society. Art as the site of thought. This is strong link with Sontag. Those of you who are interested in reading Sontag's notebooks, there are great entries about how at a certain point, after encountering the art of Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, so the avant-garde of the 50s, she becomes convinced that art is the site of critical thought, a thought capable of questioning givens and assumptions, and a thought that is capable of taking a distance from power. I will stop here, reminding you that there is the works cited slide included in the PowerPoint, and I've highlighted, in red with ink, the recent translation of Carla Lonzi's writings. You will find also a translation of The Solitude. The critic, the excerpt that I've uploaded, I translated the excerpt, and so the translation will be different. Thank you very much. I suggest we take a 5-minute break, and then we return. This is just a suggestion. I don't know what you think, Rashni or Atolento. We return and I deliver a lecture too, and then we can take questions, conversation in the tutorials. What do you think?
Right.
Take
Yeah,
5
ma'am.
minutes.
Obviously. Yeah, thank you for your lecture. And definitely we will take a 5 minutes break and we will resume with the next lecture whenever you are ready. And we can take up the comments and questions. Definitely we will have a lot of them. So in the tutorial, we have the tutorial session for that. So the participants can interact with you in that session. So
Yes.
we can take a 5 minutes break and come back
Clearly, if
whenever
there
you
are
are ready.
comments, urgent comments, if there are urgent comments that cannot wait for the tutorials, I welcome them. Of course, I don't want to discourage people from interacting.
Currently, I don't see anything in the chat
Yeah.
box. So
Yeah.
maybe during the second session, we can take those up if there is any.
Thank you,
Thank you, ma'am.
Atalanta.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.